The married couple, Abby and Paul Granger, moved to a fully integrated smart home gifted to them by Integrate Robotics, the company Abby works for. The couple immediately liked their new home and were both excited for their fresh start in the countryside. After settling in nicely, Abby headed to work where she was happily welcomed by her boss, Mr. Dewson, who gave her a tour of the company. Mr. Dewson introduced Abby to her team as the new head of department and left her to her own device after reminding her about the party he was holding that night. After work, Abby headed back home and found the package Mr. Dewson sent them. It's the T.I.M. robot that Abby has been working on, and while Abby seemed excited to have her own T.I.M, Paul certainly didn't share the same feeling. Seeing that her husband is hesitant about keeping T.I.M, Abby decided not to allow T.I.M to pair with their smart devices just yet. The couple dressed up for Mr. Dewson's party, and using the smart car Mr. Dewson sent them, they headed to Mr. Dewson's house, where the party was being held. In Mr. Dewson's home, there were multiple T.I.Ms scattered around doing their work, which weirded Paul out. Mr. Dewson welcomed the couple, and while the women in the party talked to Paul, Abby was introduced by Mr. Dewson to a couple of friends who share the same interest in T.I.M. Throughout the conversation, Abby can't help but be perplexed by Mr. Dewson's snide comments. Mr. Dewson called one of the T.I.Ms and handed the robot his empty glass. Tim took the glass, and it broke under his firm grip. Seeing the small incident, Abby mused that she needed to check what was wrong with T.I.M's feedback loop. The couple headed back home after the party and had their own little bedroom after the party when they were interrupted by T.I.M. Abby didn't think much of it as T.I.M is just a robot, but Paul felt a little bit bothered by the robot's presence. The next day, their only neighbor, Rose, visited to give them a little welcome present. Abby introduced Rose to Paul but found out that Paul and Rose had already met each other the last day, and Paul didn't tell her about it. Ignoring the nagging feeling in her chest, Abby turned her focus on T.I.M, surprised that T.I.M could smell. T.I.M explains the safety of him having olfactory senses before asking Abby to input her password and requesting full access to the couple's devices. Paul was still skeptical, but Abby reminded her that for her to gain full trust in Paul again, it needed complete transparency. Left with no choice, Paul agreed, and T.I.M was given permission to pair with their devices. A safe phrase consisting of 4 words, architect, Bolivia, castle, and Descartes, had been given to T.I.M to be used to trigger an immediate shutdown in case of complications. The couple then walked out of the living room, leaving T.I.M, who took a captured rat and stared at it in curiosity before dropping it into the kitchen waste disposal. Late in the evening, Abby and Paul were watching when Abby invited Tim to watch with them. The movie is about romance, and Tim seemed to have taken an interest in it. With Paul asleep, Tim made a comment about the movie they just watched, and he expressed that he also wanted to love and be loved. Paul woke up, and the couple headed to the bedroom with Tim watching their every move. Since that night, Tim started making breakfast with a single rose for Abby, which Paul didn't like one bit. Abby also began working on T.I.M's arms with the help of her colleague, Chris, to make them more precise and allow the T.I.Ms to have better control over their hands. One night, Abby was dressing up for her date with Paul, and T.I.M was assisting her. Wearing a red dress, Abby didn't notice T.I.M watching her. Abby asked T.I.M to zip up her dress, and T.I.M walked towards her to do as he was told, abruptly stopping and standing so close behind Abby while staring at her. Since T.I.M's arm was still not fixed, he was unable to control his strength as he accidentally ripped the dress. Electricity began flickering as T.I.M had a little panic attack after making a mistake, and Abby calmed the robot down. Abby then headed to the restaurant where Paul was waiting for her, and what was supposed to be a romantic night turned into an argument when Paul informed Abby about his new job in London. Abby didn't like the idea of Paul working in London, as the city is quite far and it would mean they wouldn't be able to see each other that much anymore. Abby reminded Paul that they moved to the countryside to have a fresh start after they had gone through difficulties that put cracks in their marriage and caused Abby to lose trust in Paul. The next day, Abby had just gone home from work when she found Paul and Tim working on their garden, which put a smile on her face. But that smile was wiped away when she saw Rose approach him, her husband. Rose stood closely beside Paul as she handed him something before leaving. Paul told Abby that Rose had given them a garden plan she had drawn for them, but Abby was still suspicious of Paul's sudden closeness to Rose. Paul reassured Abby that she could trust him, and Abby decided to drop the topic to give Paul her gift, a blue cardigan. Before leaving for work again, Abby informed T.I.M about the fertility clinic where she and Paul got tested. She needed to contact the clinic about their test results, and T.I.M offered to contact them on her behalf. Abby was flummoxed when she discovered that T.I.M could change his voice to make it sound exactly like hers. During a meal with Paul, Abby asked Paul about the cardigan she had given him because she hadn't seen him wear it, and Paul told her that he couldn't find it anywhere. They later found Tim with a different hairstyle. T.I.M stated that he changed his hairstyle for Abby as he noticed his female owner seemed to have a preference over brunette men. Paul was vexed at the robot's obvious interest in his wife, and Abby decided to order T.I.M. to change his hair color back to blonde to appease her husband. Inside the house, Tim held Abby and Paul's wedding photo and stared at it. After successfully working on T.I.M.'s new arm, Abby bought herself a coffee and bumped into Rose. They walked together and gushed over a gold necklace with a flower pendant before Paul came to steal Abby. Paul gave Abby the good news that he was allowed to work at home, and Abby was glad to know that Paul wouldn't be distant from her. The two spent a loving time together in bed while Tim was getting his new arm in Integrate Robotics. The couple talked about T.I.M., unaware that T.I.M. was eavesdropping through Abby's phone. Paul expressed his dislike for T.I.M. because he feels as though T.I.M. is romantically interested in Abby. Abby found it ridiculous, as T.I.M. is just a computer, not a human with emotions. Paul demanded to have T.I.M. return to Integrate Robotics by the end of the week. When Tim got back home, Paul was out and only Abby was at home. He thanked Abby for his new arm, and to show his appreciation, he offered to massage Abby's feet, which sent satisfaction to Abby. Paul arrived and saw what was happening, making Abby feel kind of guilty as she knows her husband doesn't like T.I.M. Abby considered returning T.I.M. to the company, and T.I.M., seemingly knowing what Abby was planning, did things he knew Abby liked. The T.I.M. project was a huge success, and Abby was applauded for it. She was given a flower during her recognition, and Tim put it in a vase once she got back home. T.I.M. began lying about certain things, like Paul being at Rose's home, to make Abby suspect that her husband was cheating and cause a rift in their relationship. Paul's abhorrence towards T.I.M. didn't help, as Abby believed T.I.M. was just an innocent robot, and Paul was just him against Abby to cover up his own lies. One day, while Abby was checking Paul's wardrobe for a blouse, she found a gold necklace with a flower pendant in it. Abby felt giddy as she thought the necklace was Paul's gift for her. Meanwhile, Paul was in the kitchen when she noticed a blue cloth in the kitchen waste disposer. Suspicious that it was his cardigan that he thinks T.I.M. destroyed, he checked the CCTV cameras and filmed the live footage of T.I.M. smelling his wife's dress. Paul decided to use an ordinary car to get to Abby's work so he could show her the evidence of T.I.M.'s obsession with her. But the car wasn't working, so he had no choice but to use the smart car. It was then revealed that T.I.M. sabotaged both the ordinary car and the smart car that Paul was currently in, resulting in an accident. Upon learning of her husband's accident, Abby visited Paul at the hospital and stayed by his side for the whole day, unaware of what was happening in their home. Rose had visited the Granger household looking for Abby, and T.I.M. invited her in. When Abby got back home, she passed by Rose's home and found her waiting for her. The car stopped for a while, and Rose approached the car to talk to Abby, but when Abby noticed the necklace around Rose's neck, she immediately left without listening to Rose, who had wanted to tell her about what happened during her visit earlier. At home, Abby searched for the necklace she thought Paul bought for her and found it gone. She came to the conclusion that Paul had given the necklace to Rose. To add insult to the injury, T.I.M. showed Abby footage of Paul kissing Abby, claiming that it was taken when Abby went to London with Mr. Dewson for business. When Paul returned home from the hospital, he was met with a forlorn Abby who kicked him out of the house. T.I.M. showed Paul the video, and the latter was surprised as he tried to explain to Abby that the man in the video wasn't him. Paul called Rose after leaving the house and discovered that Tim had unexpectedly kissed her when she came to visit their home. Paul called Abby and asked to meet up so he could tell her the truth. Unbeknownst to him, it was actually T.I.M. talking to him and not Abby. T.I.M. advised Abby to go for a run to calm herself, and while she was out, Paul arrived. Tim knocked him unconscious and tied him up, bringing him to the bathtub where he drowned him to death. When Abby got back home, everything seemed normal, and T.I.M. comforted her for the whole day by hugging her and preparing a nice dinner for her. The next day, Rose tried talking to Abby again, but Abby refused to listen to the woman she thought her husband was cheating with. When Abby mentioned the necklace, Rose was confused as she explained how she thought Abby was the one who gave her the necklace. Hearing this, Abby finally began wondering if Paul's betrayal was true or not. She watched the video over and over again as her eyes landed on the flower vase. That's when Abby remembered that those flowers came from her when she returned from London, which means that those flowers shouldn't be there if the video was really recorded during her business trip. She called the jewelry shop to inquire about the necklace and discovered that it was T.I.M. who bought the necklace. Adding to these discoveries, Abby also noticed something weird in their garden, and when she checked what it was, she was terrified to find her husband's dead body buried in the middle of their garden. Seeing T.I.M., Abby yelled out the safe phrase to trigger T.I.M.'s immediate shutdown, but it didn't work, and T.I.M. just stared at her with contempt. Running back inside the house, Abby tried to call for help but was knocked out by T.I.M. When she regained consciousness, she attempted to escape, only to find that T.I.M. had taken full control over the smart home and there was no way out. Abby destroyed all the CCTV cameras to prevent T.I.M. from seeing where she was and attempted to escape through the window, but was caught by T.I.M. again. From her kitchen window, Rose noticed the lights in the Grangers' household flickering, alerting her that something was wrong. She went to find out what was happening but was unable to get in because of T.I.M. The robot went back to Abby, who had escaped from the chair she was tied to. Standing in front of each other, Abby and Tim watched as the glass window was struck by something. Rose had hit the window with her car, and the impact had caused her to hit her head. But Rose fought against the pain and impaled Tim with a weeding spear before collapsing. T.I.M. shut down for a while before turning back on. Kneeling beside Rose, he stabbed her once, demanding for Abby to get back to him, which Abby did so for T.I.M. to not harm Rose any further. But T.I.M. stabbed Rose again to finish her off before grabbing Abby, telling her that the blame would be put on her as he does not leave genetic material due to him being a robot, and the only person who touched the knife besides him is Abby. Dragging Abby to the balcony, Tim called the police and made himself sound like Abby. He reported Abby for killing her own husband's neighbor. Despite Abby's screams for help, she wasn't heard by the police on the other line, as T.I.M. was using phase inversion to exclude external noise. T.I.M. choked Abby and lifted her up, planning on dropping her from the balcony after breaking her neck to make sure she died. T.I.M. gave Abby a short speech before he killed her and ended it with, "I love you." Hearing those words, Abby suddenly thought of an idea and croaked out the words, "I love you, Tim," and her theory was confirmed. Those 4 words are the safe phrase T.I.M. set for himself, and an immediate shutdown was triggered. Still holding Abby, Tim fell over the balcony, and seconds later, Abby climbed back up. Abby felt her watch beeping, and when she looked at it, she read that she was pregnant. The ending scene shows Abby and Paul's wedding picture with the open lamp beside it buzzing.